He's a SLED security strategist at Palo Alto Networks. He served in operational, tactical, and strategic roles within major research universities as well as within health science centers. So please give a warm welcome to Hunter.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to hide behind this podium. So that's why I got the computer moved over. I'm a recovering introvert, so I have to have something to hide behind. Just a quick background on me. I spent the last 15 years in higher ed, 7 of those as a CISO of an R1 university, and I'm still sort of adjusting to the other side. But it's really great to see groups like this. I'm a big fan of EDUCAUSE security professionals as well. There's another community-based conference. It's great to see you guys sharing information, and hopefully I can give you a couple little nuggets today. In lieu of an agenda slide, which I was told in class one time that you had to have for every presentation, and then somebody told me that only losers use agenda slides, so I'll just tell you what the agenda is. We're going to talk about some of the business challenges associated with compliance and security. We'll talk about how the NIST Cybersecurity Framework fits into that, and then a new paradigm or a new way of looking at security in a sort of more holistic sense. So I pulled together some logos that I thought you guys would recognize. This is certainly not all the compliance that you would see as a university or even a local government, because there's a lot of overlap in the way universities operate versus the way local government operates. But things like FERPA, that's a top priority for universities. FISMA, which is a federal requirement around physical security of assets related to research in a university environment. CJIS. Who in here has heard of CJIS? Oh, good. Like a year ago, no one knew about it. It's very strange how it just sort of became sort of front of mind. But CJIS is criminal justice information. So if you have a police department or you have interactions with law enforcement and you need to get national criminal information, you have to be CJIS compliant. And of course, NSF has all kinds of various compliance needs depending on the research. And then there's things like HIPAA, which if you're not a med center, you don't worry about as much, but you do have some healthcare components. And then things like GDPR, which don't exist in the United States, but we have some responsibility for our foreign students and faculty and et cetera. Then there's state compliance needs like CCPA, the California compliance standard, and we have to sort of meet those things as well, even though they're not directly applicable to your situations, but you have to think about those things in a bigger sense. I know this goes without saying, but we always want to talk about compliance and security are two things, right? Compliance, I'm going to describe as a guidepost. I'm also going to describe the CSF as a guidepost, but compliance is pointing you down the road. But compliance is not going to equal security in most cases. Compliance just means you've met whatever those minimum standards are. In a research environment, I would often work with researchers who would receive data from NSF or other granting agencies, and then they would have some sort of requirements around how they handled that data. It was very bespoke depending on the project, but it was compliance nonetheless. Now, there were several times that we did those, and it really didn't meet a security standard as far as me or my team could see, but it was the compliance piece that they needed to get their research done. But we see this again and again. Checkbox compliance is both time-consuming and ultimately not very effective. So we want to think about compliance as something that you must achieve, but it's not the goal. It's not the ultimate goal. It's just down the road towards security. Everybody here that has interacted with several departments on your campus or interacted with other organizations that are related know that there's vastly different business needs based upon what your recruiters want. They need to be able to be out in the field and visit high schools and recruit those students. We have staff that want to be able to just do their jobs at their desk, and that's a sort of an easier way to meet compliance. But then you have researchers, faculty that want to update their grade book from the Starbucks, or they want to, interact with your, university's confidential data in non-standard ways. And we as security professionals have to find that balance of what are the business needs and how can we secure that. And, to look back to the last presentation, how do we do that without getting in the way? Because we can't tell faculty what to do. I mean, that's just the reality of it. And, it was always a career-limiting move to tell a researcher what to do because they can just take their ball and go home. So you have to think about how do you meet these business needs, how do you meet those compliance needs, and ultimately, how do you reduce cyber risk? So reducing cyber risk is really thinking about things from a risk perspective instead of a compliance perspective, and we'll dig into that a little bit more as we go along. Issues with common compliance. A checkbox approach is just that. One of the things that I would often have to do is, a researcher would send me a document that had 50 items on it that needed to be secured in some way, and they couldn't tell me about any of them. So I'd have to, I would go in, or somebody on my small staff would go in. We'd have to actually do a full risk assessment based upon one tiny little project to meet those compliance needs. And it just wasn't scalable. And at the end of the day, like I said, there was a couple of projects we did that met compliance, but we didn't feel were secure, so we still had to do things on top of that. And checkbox compliance is not focused on a risk reduction strategy. It's focused on protecting in the case of PCI, for example, the payment card providers. Not you, it's about protecting them. Most compliance is about security of the other side, not necessarily you. So that's not a risk reduction approach. Now you can take a risk reduction approach and meet compliance, but ultimately improve security as well. And as I mentioned, it's a suboptimal use of staff resources because every one of these that comes through, you have to evaluate on its own merits, and then make decisions around that per project. It's just it doesn't scale, especially the university where I came from had a very small staff. We had big ambitions, but we couldn't plan for the future if we were only focusing on the present. So we've talked a little bit about compliance. Let's talk about what the NIST Cybersecurity Framework is and how that can help you understand these things in a sort of a common language. In the early mid-2000s, security started to really become a big part of enterprise IT and really became something that general IT practitioners started to pay attention to. Now, it wasn't until the mid-late 2000s, early 2009, 10, 11, that security became pervasive. And it became very clear that the National Institute of Standards and Technology needed to come up with a set of definitions. Now, the reason for this is because security means many things to many people, and how you apply it means many things to many people, and having a common language to use and a common framework to work from is key to understanding how you do security at your university and how your peers do security at their university, so you can compare on a level playing field. It also is a framework in which that you can pick and choose those parts within the subcategories that make sense for your use. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's a giant document. It's not worth memorizing, but it's worth understanding. In fact, I'm going to distill it way down for you. Everything beyond that is details. In 2018, there was a slight revision to it, but it doesn't change the general gist of what the cybersecurity framework is. It just added a couple of subcategories and clarified a couple of things. So this is my distilled version of what the cybersecurity framework is. There's endless documentation available that explains each piece under here. I'm just going to go through a couple of these and sort of explain where they fit in the big context. Identify. This means understand, right? What's going on in your infrastructure? What kind of traffic is normal? What do you have on your network? That includes asset management. the business environment, understanding what you're trying to accomplish from a business perspective. This goes back to balancing risk with business objectives. Governance, including things like patch management, configuration management, which is something that's becoming an increasing problem in the cloud space, and then what your risk management strategy is overall. And let me just take a quick moment. Who here is in the security function of your, okay, so of you guys, who has spoken to or interacted with your risk management office at your university? I think it's key that we understand that the risk management office, while they don't understand what we do, that's not important. We deliver to them a basic understanding of risks. They can do things like buy cyber insurance. They can do things like help us push people along that aren't interested in meeting those security objectives. So I highly recommend you work with your risk management office. It's incredibly important. I think I've gotten more mileage out of that relationship in my previous life than anything else. The next step is protect. This is about your basic security stuff, access control, identity access management, security awareness and training, which I think we've all gotten very good at. What your information protection processes and procedures are. I think there's always room for improvement there, and I've seen at most universities I've been to that that's sort of a weak spot because you're so busy trying to implement and maintain that you're not building those procedures in a repeatable way. So CSS has a lot to say about that. And then things like maintenance, what do you define as maintenance windows? What do those actually mean? What technologies do you use to protect the network? Things like DLP or CASB or any number of other technologies, DNS security, et cetera. The detect phase is kind of my most, I guess my favorite, because this is where the rubber meets the road. If you can see all of your assets and you understand what your inventory looks like, then you can begin to detect changes, detect anomalies. I really love the Bayesian statistical analysis that Columbia was doing. That's really, really neat. And it's a way of detecting. There's many other methods, but I think that's a really interesting and clever way of detecting those anomalies. I believe you should use as many as you can, which is not in defense in depth. I'll get into that in a minute. But detecting anomalies and events, monitoring continuously, and then building those detection processes. Respond is something we've all gotten used to. How do you prepare for an attack? How do you stop an attack? How do you clean up in the middle of attack? How do you preserve that evidence that you may need for your recovery phase? These are all things built into the response function. And recovery is something that I'm not going to talk about too much because that's so incredibly specific to each situation. But just know that recovery means, are your backups current? How can you improve that? And how do you communicate things like, the system's going to be down for this amount of time because we have to restore from backup, and here are your alternatives. So this is probably the most important slide in the whole thing, just understanding the basics of what the cybersecurity framework is, and then thinking about things from a risk reduction strategy and fitting it into this model. So I'm going to talk about a new approach to compliance that's ultimately a new approach to security. So good cyber hygiene. We spend a lot of time as security professionals responding to events. Good cyber hygiene is spending time at the front end thinking about how do you VLAN your network, how do you build those zones. Things like one of the projects that I wandered into a couple of years ago was doing something about our camera and door control systems. Those were loosely managed for a long time, and I had a lot of law enforcement in my background, so they sort of threw that on my plate. And what I found was we were putting cameras everywhere in the university, and we were putting them on the wireless network that everybody else was using. And it didn't take but a couple hours for my guys to start digging into that and find, oh, these cameras, they were installed by some third party. They're using, the factory passwords. And the ones that were pan, tilt, zoom were often moved around. Clearly somebody was getting into those cameras. We had hundreds of them. The door controls were a little better off because they're an IoT device and they're a little harder to get to. But the cameras were just, it was stunning to me. So from a cyber hygiene perspective, what was the first thing we did? We moved them all into their own VLAN, and we cut that off from everybody else, and we gave it access specifically to users and services that needed it. That's what cyber hygiene means. So you have to constantly iterate on that and constantly try to improve your cyber hygiene. By doing that, you can reduce risk because you're reducing the surface area. It's really sort of that simple. If the attacker can't see these things, they can't, build a plan of attack against them, and then they have to look in other areas. So it slows the attacker down, it reduces the attack surface. And then ultimately we want to take a threat prevention approach instead of a response approach. One of the things that's a little different about this than the previous presentation is that we want to try to stop attacks before they start and let your security guys know about it, but don't waste their time responding to these things if they're common attacks. We see this in a lot of ways in minimal sort of use with URL whitelists and blacklists, DNS domain generated DNS, things like that. But we want to talk about a threat prevention approach across the entire infrastructure. Excuse me. So to think about things from a prevention mindset, you have to have visibility. I hinted at this earlier, but this really means you have to instrument your network. And in the past, the way networks were instrumented was, NetFlow is a great tool. Firewalls using ports and protocols is a great tool. But these only provided limited visibility, and it provided visibility where traffic converged. So anytime you have a perimeter point or convergence point, you can measure that, but you can't measure it in the bigger context. So what you need is complete visibility, and this is, traditionally it's been sort of east-west, in and out of the data center, in and out of the cloud provider, but not up and down the stack, meaning within the data center or within your cloud resources. So you need to think about traffic not just moving in and out of those areas, but up and through that stack as well. Because a lot of times what you'll see with command and control is they'll get a byte in, and then they'll spend all their time up and down the stack internal to that network before coming back out again. And in the process, they've owned all these machines, and you haven't seen anything anomalous until you start seeing the command and control come out. We saw this quite a bit at my previous university in our labs. They would come in, they would start, they would own one machine in the lab, and then just go right down because the IP addresses were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And they just go through, own all those machines, and now they've got a botnet ready to go. And we wouldn't see any of that traffic between them because we had no way to instrument them. So this idea of complete visibility, instrumenting your network everywhere you can, and then integrating all of that instrumentation and automating it so that when you see, you have normal traffic. And just as an example, I was thinking about this last night. As an example, you see 2 gig a day of DNS requests coming from your entire network. In an enterprise, that may make sense because you're requesting that much DNS. Now, if that suddenly goes up to 10 times that or 5 times that, what's going on? Why is DNS suddenly changing? Are these DNS tunnel attacks? Is this fileless attacks coming in through DNS? Without having an understanding of what that traffic looks like, and not integrating it into all these other instruments, you can't make decisions on whether that's good or bad. It may be normal. You may have had a conference come in and a bunch of new people are on the network that you were totally expecting that, but as a security professional you may not know that, so you wouldn't know what the context of that is. And this all leads to end-to-end protection. And what that means is endpoint, network, cloud, anywhere that you've got resources, you need to instrument those in some way, and then that will build out a prevention architecture that can actually stop things that are outside of the norm. So some of the benefits are improved productivity, and this is a sales slide, so I'll apologize on that. But what I saw personally is absolutely the case of improved productivity, because if you spend time on the front end instrumenting your network, and you spend time thinking about how to minimize the attack surface and prevent those attacks, then you're not you're not spending all your time looking through your SIM at alerts and trying to determine whether those are meaningless or not. You know, a few years ago we got a SIM in, and we were very excited about it, and within a couple of months we found out that's all we were doing was looking at alerts. You know, we'd spend 20 minutes looking at an alert, like, oh, that's normal, check that one off. And it was just a time sink. So if you can automate some of these things and integrate your tools, then you can reduce those, the time doing those things and spend more time on building a better, more resilient network, et cetera. You'll have data protection built into the platform as you think about things from a threat prevention approach, because those automated attacks or those automated responses are just thwarting attacks and protecting that data, so you don't have to find out after it's left. You just note that there was some attack, you mitigate for it, and you move on. The data hasn't left. And that, of course, leads to better cybersecurity. So from a prevention approach, these are the three things you have to have. I've talked quite a bit about increased visibility. That's critical. If you don't have the visibility into what's going on in your network, and my old CIO used to say that he and I would always butt heads because he wanted to buy the 10 gig, 100 gig capable equipment, and then at the time security equipment couldn't ever scale to that. That has completely changed in the last few years. So thinking about that you can't monitor these things and you can't have that visibility is sort of an old way of thinking, because you absolutely can do that these days, and there's equipment that easily scales to the speeds and feeds that universities are used to. Improving cyber hygiene, again, that's just thinking of your VLAN and zoning strategy, and maybe sort of expanding it from what it was. When I first started in my CISO role, we had 5 zones. When I left, we had about 12. And the reason for that was because we had the door control network and the camera network, and we were really good about segmenting those out. And I really had to fight with our network folks on that, because they were very concerned about too many zones causing the firewall to fall on its face. Again, we don't have that problem anymore, and we need to start thinking towards the future. And lastly is evolve continuously. This isn't directly related, but I thought it was a good story to tell because it sort of explains in the simplest details what I experienced. So I did forensics for several years back in the early 2000s, and one of the things that forensic examiners did for years in the 80s and 90s was consult a hash library. So you had known bad images, known bad videos, and there was a hash to match those. So you go to your forensic machine, you'd hash everything on the drive that you were looking at, and then you just start matching hashes. Well, when I first started doing that, I'd actually get hits. So if we were working on a child pornography case and I had 1 or 2 hits on a hash, I shipped that because that case was as good as one, because you could not fight. At the time it was MD5, I think it's SHA now, or maybe the other way. But very soon, within the first couple of years of doing that, I wasn't matching hashes at all, because it didn't take long for the criminals to realize that you just resave these images, make one tiny change or change the compression on JPEG. The hash is completely useless at that point. Evolve continuously is about that. It's about looking at the picture and not looking at the hash. So the picture hasn't changed much, but that required human intervention. Now, humans could compare those, but now we have machine learning and big data analytics and artificial intelligence. It can actually do those things for you. So think about it in that way. We're looking for the picture, not the hash. That's what evolve continuously really means. It means understanding not the specifics of that attack, but the way it's happening. So we look at this as a platform problem, and we think about this as instrumenting everything across the network and on down, and then feeding that up into a threat database. You have to have it gives you visibility and control everywhere, regardless of whether they're mobile, regardless of whether they're on campus or not. It's integrated, and that's again key. because you want, your CASB system to inform your DLP system, for example, because those things will have crossover. And if you see some sort of threat from a specific actor in one system, you need to be able to tell all of your other security systems in some sort of automated way that that's an attack or that's a bad threat actor. And then you have to automate using analytics and build in these playbooks for different kinds of responses to attacks so that your staff isn't spending time looking through alerts. They're just understanding what was blocked, and then the alerts that they look at are truly meaningful, truly hard questions to solve, and are worth their time. Without those three, a platform approach just doesn't make sense. So I meant to change this because I didn't like the word hub, but it's not really what I would define next generation firewall as, but I'm going to leave it in here for the purposes of conversation. The firewall is an instrument. Classic firewalls were based upon access lists, ports and protocols, interzone or intrazone traffic, that sort of thing. What a next generation firewall does, and this is like a key piece, is it says, what is the app behavior? What are these users doing? Is this something these users normally do? Is this application behave in this way? DNS is a great example of that. Port 53 is a common port that's left wide open, and nobody pays any attention to it because requests go out, answers come in, all is good. But if you send a request in a certain way, you can get data back that you can then reassemble. So a DNS tunnel attack looks like DNS traffic to anyone, but if you're not looking for that payload, then you don't know what's happening. Back to what I was saying about a spike in DNS traffic. What does that really mean? Does that mean a tunnel has been established, or does that just mean there's more people, looking up more stuff? You need to think about tools that integrate well. About the time that the CSF came out, there was sort of a shift in the way security companies looked at security. In the mid 2000s, security companies wanted you to buy their stack, because everything talked to each other in the stack, and it didn't share that with anybody. And then you're locked into that. And how do you get out of it? The thing that has changed is a lot of security companies, and I believe rightfully so, are starting to share intelligence, and they're starting to build API connectors between products so that you can actually see that threat data, emanating from one instrument and then being acted on by another. I did a project a couple years ago that I was really proud of at the time, and it was immediately old news. Like, by the time I did the presentation on it, the problem had been solved. But I used a product called FireEye and a product called OpenDNS, and I actually took threat data from FireEye into JSON files and then fed them into OpenDNS, and we did it across schools. So we had, a few schools. All the schools were running both, and they were taking that data and then cross-pollinating it with the other schools. So if school A saw a bad domain name, that JSON file would then be shipped over to the other schools and vice versa. It was very clever, but within a year or two, that sort of idea had lost steam because the security companies had started making that data available to each other for the purposes of control. So anytime you have a disconnected security tool, you have to really think, am I getting the value out of this? The one or small subset of things it does, completely outside of the context of the rest of the university. And then as we move down the road, we want to get better with analytics. We want to get better with machine learning, and use the firewall as a control point for that. So the firewall can see traffic. It may not know what's going on with it, but it can send that threat data up, and then it gets an answer back that says this is bad. So it's a control point. So I mentioned east-west and north-south traffic. When you think of a firewall strategy, you have to think about, is this the right instrument, right? But where do I need to put these things so that I can get this visibility? So keep in mind that within the data center is a place you want to look at those things too. There are lots of options there. We do a software-based virtual machine that fits into a stack and can look at machines within that cluster. Other folks do that as well, but looking at that traffic up and down and not necessarily even building policies at the time, but having a view into it is critical. And that way your analytics will get better over time, because the way machine learning works, the way artificial intelligence works, is you have to keep throwing data at it until it can paint some sort of picture that it understands as normal, and then can derive some deviations from that as a way to build alerts. I'm going to speed up a little bit here because I know I'm standing between you guys and lunch. So I'm going to say it, antivirus is dead. When I was at my last job, we bought antivirus just before I left, but I bought it on a 2-year contract because my assumption at the time was this will be the last time I buy this. I'll either buy something else or I'll find some other endpoint security product that actually makes sense. Back to what I was saying earlier, antivirus was largely built around hashing. It was built around signatures. Those signatures change 1,000 times a day on certain attacks. I mean, every time it's run, it's recompiled. So how can you look at those kinds of attacks from a signature basis and think you're making any sort of dent? So you want to look at an endpoint product that does all of what I've described, right? It is an instrument on the network. It tells you what's going on, and it can block common attacks based upon the way they attack, not how they attack. I'm sorry. Yeah, the results of that attack, not just the way they got in the door, because those are going to change every time. And then, of course, you stop those threats with shared intelligence, and then you detect and respond to attacks in the bigger sense based upon machine learning. So if you see a sort of activity around the network that is indicating some sort of anomalous behavior, you can then make sense of that in the bigger context. That's why this visibility is such a key part of this. So all of this applies to the cloud. It's applied differently, but it applies to the cloud. And if you don't, I've heard a few universities say, well, we're not going to the cloud. I can tell you you're already there, for one thing, because you're probably using, who uses Office 365 in here? G Suite, Box.com, Dropbox, these are all SaaS applications. That's in the cloud. We break it up into 3 points, but I'm going to talk about SaaS first. A couple years ago, I looked at a CASB. It was actually Palo Alto's at the time. And we did a proof of concept, and within 10 minutes, it had discovered a file that one of our VIP's assistants had made that was all of his travel info. His social security number, his birth date, his address, his credit card numbers, everything. It was her cheat sheet for booking travel and buying stuff. And it was just shared to the world. That was in 10 minutes I found that out, and that file had been out there for months. So then we had to go through a process of who's accessed this file. We had to go through a big response to that, and luckily it hadn't been accessed, but it was something that was completely invisible to us, and it was Box.com at the time, but it applies at G Suite and everything else. The other thing in cloud is access to those resources. You want to build a security model that allows things like, well, they're coming from on campus. This is a known good IP. This is a known good network. We'll just let them in with username and password. No big deal. But the next time they log in, they're from the Starbucks or whatever. Okay, we're going to MFA challenge them, or we're going to put them, in a VPN connection, depending on what your security model allows. You need to be able to do that automatically in every time. It was funny when I changed my university life to my first private sector life. We had to go in and turn on the VPN every time we left the office, and it's like you had to remember to do that. And you couldn't figure out why some things would work and some things weren't, because security wasn't applied consistently across all those assets. So it made it very confusing for me, a technologist, let alone somebody that has no idea what VPN really does or means. So you need to be able to do that automatically and allow your users to just do their work how they want and build that security for them. And then, of course, cloud-native applications like virtual machines in the cloud, or serverless functions, or containerized applications. We see a lot of that in research these days, particularly around serverless functions. So you want to build a function that does a certain thing, You put it out on AWS, and then you can expand that as wide as you need to do the HPC function without having a high-performance computer. We've seen this quite a bit, but how do you secure that so it doesn't get abused or it doesn't get retooled for a bad actor? Same thing with containers. It's part of the DevOps cycle in containers, but the same rules apply. So this is looking forward a little bit. All of this threat data needs to be brought into a common repository. We call ours the Cortex data lake, but this idea of large data sets of unstructured data that you then, unleash machine learning upon so that you can build that picture, that's going to become a bigger and bigger piece of that because attackers are getting faster, they're changing their tactics all the time, and we have to understand how those attacks flow across all these scenarios, whether it's on-prem, off-prem, cloud, whatever. And then you have to use that same insight to get a view into what's going on, so that the security function can actually, those folks can actually look in and say, where are we seeing the hot spots? Where's, who's being targeted, and we need to make some changes to those guys. And lastly is orchestrating changes across the entire system. If you have that visibility, you have that data, and you have those analytics, then you can orchestrate and automate and resolve these problems. If you have a threat happening on one side of your network and you see a different one on the other, but they're related, you can actually relate those things. So it's important to have that sort of holistic top-down view. So I'm going to skip that last slide. This is the slide I'm going to leave up because I love this one. This sort of shows our commitment to higher ed. I spent my entire career up until this point in higher ed. I want to support this forever. So I love the fact that we as a company are taking higher ed very seriously. And with that, I'll let you guys go to lunch. All right? Thank you for your time.